Greetings, YouTube. Today we're talking about Otherlands, a world in the making by Thomas Haley, and the cover art is by Alan Lane, which is kind of interesting that they actually give the artist's name right here in on the cover itself. I don't know if I've ever seen somebody put their name on the cover itself. A little blurb on the back is full of wonder and fascination, exquisitely written. This is a time travel of spectacular dimension, and that is from Isabella Tree. But this is interesting. Best book on the history of life on Earth I have ever read, Tom Holland. I have no idea if that is Tom Holland, the actor, or someone else named Tom Holland. Um, and this is essentially biological evolutionary. It's history, but it's also a bit of extrapolation. I can't say speculation so much, is because the author is basing everything that they're talking about on research, and this is from 2022, so the research is relatively recent. In fact, the book itself in the epilogue actually discusses COVID and the impact it's had on like our carbon footprint and of our species, and the effect on the environment when suddenly we turned off everything for in response to COVID itself. The water in the Venice canals got better, and skies got clear, and things like that. Because our impact on the environment is having an effect on what life is on this planet now and what life will be on this planet in the future. Interestingly, he does discuss the fact that glass sponges are actually making a recovery of lands that they at one time controlled a long time ago, as the more well-known traditional coral reefs are dying off because the glass sponges do better in the environment that we have created for them. Interesting. I'd like to look at a little more research on that. But this book takes place in our past, and the author takes different epochs from our history based on actual fossil records and research and things like that. And he does this in descending order of time. So the first chapter is the one closest to us. It's the one that would have taken place just as humans were entering the picture, what the world looked like. And then the next epoch is like a million years before that. And he jumps through history. At the beginning of each chapter, he gives you a map of what the world looks like, how the land masses have changed, or how their glaciation would have been different from what it is now, and things like that. So the maps in this were really cool because they changed drastically. And there's one in front of each chapter, so you can see how the continents are just kind of they're just sliding and slipping across our globe, and which I've always found fascinating, the idea of there being supercontinents, and how the Appalachian mountain range, which is so well known in the United States, the rest of it is in Scotland. Because at one time they were right next to each other, and then eventually they were separated. And how old the Appalachian Mountain Range? The Appalachian Mountain Range predates trees. But then again, so do sharks. But it's a really old range. And it's a fascinating snapshot of each era. Some of it was a little daunting because he is throwing lots of taxonomic terms at you, the actual Latin names for a lot of animals and some plants. And there is a single illustration for each chapter. So you get the chapter, on the left page there's going to be a map. You flip the page and there'll be an illustration on the next page. And that's the only illustrations you're going to get for that entire chapter. And I think that is where Thomas Halliday really dropped the ball on what this book could have been. Because he talks a lot about animals that are fascinating. Now, I have, over the course of my 58 years, read a lot about different prehistoric animals that predate humanity. And so, and I've gone through some of the research eras from when dinosaurs were, when I grew up, like the Brontosaurus the Apatosaurus would have been creatures that like walked on the bottom of rivers, and their necks were used because they had their heads above the waters to act as snorkels, because no one could conceive of an animal that big not being supported by water. Now, in retrospect, that's pretty silly, but as you can look at their evolutionary structure, how their legs and things were built, and you're like, yo, that's an awful lot like an elephant, just on a bigger scale. So I'm pretty sure that they were walking around without the support of water. But I've been through a number of discoveries eras when it came to paleontology. So that's always been kind of cool, and I've read up a lot of this over my lifetime. And I've always loved the illustrations of those creatures. They're just unbelievably fascinating. They're also very useful for remembering things. When you're trying to remember what the difference is between two names, and those names could be relatively close to each other, it helps a lot if you have a mental image to attach to it. Now, he does a good job of describing the animals, don't get me wrong, and they do make some legitimate speculations about what they look like, for an extent that, yes, an animal in this particular environment probably had these kind of like colorations, and we know that their hunting or their foraging characteristics had to fit into certain niches because of their teeth, their dental structure and things like that. But some of them he's just basing on what we know now about existing animals, and I think it was all reasonable. I don't think he went on a limb anywhere. I think he made very reasonable choices, and those descriptions did help make the connection between those somewhat strange words and what he's describing. It would have been so much easier if he had put an illustration for every single animal that he mentioned. I've seen some illustrations of these animals. Okay, I know they exist. And if you have a phone, it's not difficult to look it up, but spelling out those words on your phone or your computer is a pain in the butt, because they're not common. They don't come easily. You're very likely going to spell them wrong, and you could be looking for the wrong thing. It would have just been a lot easier for him to maybe do a smidge editing to make up some space, because it's a pretty decent sized book, 300 plus pages. Make some space for those illustrations, and I think that he would have produced a much better product. I remember hearing a story about Stephen Hawking when he was working on the book A Brief History of Time, and his editor said, flat out, it says, for every formula you place in your book, you're going to lose half your readers. So the only scientific formula he put in the book was E equals mc squared. And the opposite of this, I think this book would have been far more approachable to your average reader if there had been more illustrations. Because for me, that's where it was lacking. Now I freely admit that part of that has to do with the fact that I have an attention disorder, and I'm autistic, so maybe I need those illustrations more than your average person does. But I think that this book would have benefited from them, and it would have really helped me frame each era's appearance and the life forms he was discussing more firmly in my brain if I had those illustrations. The ones that he did put in there, and the maps, were very cool, don't get me wrong. I love a good speculative map. No, not speculative, but a good, what would be a good term for that? Well, they are historical maps. But regardless, I love a good map, period. And so getting to see how the different continents changed over time was very cool. And he always put the names of the terms as known scientifically. So they did like Pangaea and Gondwana, and the oceans had different names, because researchers need these things to make references for discussing things with people. But he also put in smaller text where this is in our world. So like southern China, Australia, Antarctica, Siberia, things like this. He put what those zones were on the map you're looking at. So it gives you an idea of how far apart and how they were in a much different location. But you also know, okay, this area is going to be, here when it's our era, which was very cool to look at. In my head, it was nice to see that. He also based each chapter in a specific location. a specific real world spot. You can go and look at that spot on a map. You could go stand in that spot in the real world, and that is where each chapter is set, in that one specific spot, and each chapter is a different spot across the globe. And it was interesting to see how he's going forward, how life became less and less complex on the land, and there was more in the ocean than there was in the land, until he got to the chapter where there is essentially almost no life at all on our surface of the planet, and it's all, under the water. He talks about the deep vents that are in the ocean, and how they're indifferent to the conditions on what's going on the surface, because they're just doing their thing, because they're not based on photosynthesis, they're based on chemosynthesis. Though he did mention that there is a particular species of creature that is actually using photosynthesis, but it's using it in infrared, because it lives in a spot on the ocean that has so much infrared energy from our heat from beneath the surface of the planet, that it's actually able to use that for biological functions. That's damn cool. That made me smile when I read that. That was very cool. There's this creature that it's under the ocean using photosynthesis, but in the infrared range, because it's getting heat from our planet. That's wild. So, other than having to get over the hurdle of all those Latin terms and not really be able to have a clear mental picture in my head of what he's talking about, I really enjoyed the book. It was approachable for the rest of it. It was interesting. He really helped understand what creatures would have been in each era and how they probably interacted. Because of, again, we know what their teeth look like. They know what their bodies are made, the sizes they had, things like that. And you were able to figure out, okay, this animal is going to be living in this type of lifestyle, and this animal is going to be living in this type of lifestyle, and this is how they probably interacted with each other, because we have, a fairly firm grasp of what, animal interactions take place in our world. So, a lot of fun. I really enjoyed Otherlands. Interestingly, I picked this up in a book called Beaverland the same day at a Goodwill. It had to be from the same person. They're both 2022, both of them dealing with biology. And I'm looking forward to reading Beaverland. I don't know if that's going to be next or not, but I really enjoyed Otherlands. And again, my only critique is I think the author could have improved their book with more illustrations. But overall, I had a lot of fun. And I can't say I necessarily think it's the best book on the history of life on Earth I have ever read with Mr. Holland, but I still think it's a solid read. And if you're into, biological evolution and things like that, I think you should take a minute and give it a read.